The last module of your course focuses on you being able to use all of these skills that you've learned throughout the course. Chapter 8 starts with how you identify what you know to be best evidence for practice. The objectives of this chapter are to describe what is considered the best evidence according to the evidence pyramid. You've seen the 6S pyramid before in earlier chapters and earlier modules. It's just a refocus on the pyramid itself. This chapter also focuses on how policies, protocols, and clinical guidelines, how they contribute to evidence for practice itself. And you have a review of how to pick best evidence for practice and describe how a knowledge translation model can assist with the uptake of evidence. As with the other chapters, there are a bunch of key terms you'll learn: best practice, clinical practice guidelines, the evidence pyramid, which you've seen before, which presents the hierarchy of evidence, the concept of knowledge synthesis, and the difference between terms such as systematic reviews, meta-analysis, and so on. The sentence that describes best practices is: best practices are recommendations that may evolve based on ongoing key expert experience, judgment, perspective, and continued research. The chapter goes into details as to why best practice guidelines are established, but essentially the idea is to deliver effective care based on current evidence, or to resolve a problem in a clinical setting, or to achieve excellence in care, to introduce an innovation, or to get rid of interventions that are not best practice, and to create work environments that enable clinical excellence. A review of the 6S pyramid. At the bottom, you have clinical reference texts. As you move up the hierarchy of case reports, case series, practice guidelines, etc. Then you have other reviews of literature, not necessarily systematic reviews. You have clinical research critiques. You have randomized controlled trials, case cohorts, control studies, evidence summaries, evidence guidelines, SRs, and Cochrane systematic reviews. Keep in mind the textbook chapter, chapter 8, does a pretty good job in telling you the difference between all of these kinds of studies. Make sure that you understand that as you move up the hierarchy or move up the pyramid, there is more curation and more review and appraisal, and that's what makes the evidence stronger as you move from the bottom to the top of the 6S pyramid. In the previous several chapters, like in chapter 5, the key was to learn how to appraise. However, now that you're at a point where you can appraise, the key is to be able to adapt what you know in order to be able to put it through the next step of implementation. So that's in order to be able to do that, you have to be able to pick the best evidence to adapt it to your cycle. Now, the chapter goes into details of how a guideline may be adapted for your practice itself. Despite the strong evidence supporting systematic reviews, there are advantages and disadvantages, and that's highlighted in Table 8.1. Anytime you research a study, there are first-level critical questions that are highlighted in your textbook. Has the topic been researched before? Is there anything new added to the body of literature? Or was the research conducted with strong, clear methods? Does the research question relate to your health and community practice area? And what does the study tell you? Are the results applicable to other contexts? And what do the results mean for your practice problem? And or questions when decisions must be made. Your textbook identifies 7 steps for implementing best practice guidelines. They're very valuable guidelines. Even if you may not be primarily responsible for implementing the 7 steps for best practice guidelines, pay attention to your workplace policies and procedures. There's a good chance that these 7 steps in some way, shape, or form are being utilized, or at least several of these steps are. Evidence-informed guidelines are very useful. They influence a lot of different things. Client information for informed decision making, so that the individual can take care, or their family can make decisions for their care. It also influences client care plans, care maps, and clinical pathways and algorithms. Obviously, evidence-informed guidelines inform system processes and outcomes. It influences vision statements, mission statements, and day-to-day practice. And what it does is it sets up learning sets and educational packages for orientation and training and staff development. Your last chapter, chapter 9 of the textbook, addresses the context of you joining the workforce at an entry-level position, and what do you do with all this information that you have at your fingertips. So you learn in this chapter how to think or how to discuss how evidence is applied in practice, and you learn how you can contribute to research uptake and practice itself. There are several key terms that you will learn, just like the other chapters: knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation, research to practice gap, and research uptake. Again, when we revisit the evidence-informed decision-making model, we go back to the cycle, and we see now that we've come a full cycle. We've gone from learning how to define the problem, searching for answers, appraising, synthesizing the information, adapting the information, and implementing it. Research uptake activities involve, this is in table 9.1, it involves several different things. So when you look at research uptake, it's a cultural process. So you have to look at mapping shareholders, tailoring research to meet other user needs, ongoing stakeholder research connection, and interactive discussion of research results. And part of capacity building is looking at internal and external capacity, constantly monitoring capacity, and designing and implementing capacity building activities. More of table 9.1, I'm going to let you read it from your textbook at this point. So as a person joining the workforce, how can you contribute and advocate for best evidence and practice? Now, this is, when I say as a person joining the workforce, I recognize that several students might already be in the workforce, and all of these strategies will apply to you as well. So one of the things that you can do to contribute for best evidence and practice is to support policy or guidelines that implement evidence. So anytime you're implementing a new practice, don't feel shy to ask what the source of this particular practice is. The other thing is to join forces with other advocates and champions in your workplace who advocate evidence-informed practice, who are knowledgeable, who are well-read, and who have good interpersonal skills to be able to discuss these new practices and the ability to influence outcomes.